Hello, Adab, Namaste. I am Vandana Narang. On behalf of the DC South Asian Arts Council, welcome to the first DC South Asian Literature Festival that's being held from May 9th to the 15th, today being our last day. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to express our support and our concern for the difficulties that everyone is going through in the South Asian communities and around the world due to the pandemic. Our prayers and our thoughts are with you all. Thank you to all of our hosts, moderators, and guest speakers for your time and participation. We look forward to the conversation and panel discussions. Please review our website at www.dcsaaci.org to see the schedule and registration. There's only one more program this evening, but we would love for you all to join us. I would like to, for this evening's session, welcome our moderator, Mr. Norman Sandridge. Norman is an associate professor of classics at Howard University and the co-executive director of Kalyan Leadership, Inc., a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting the study of the humanities for leadership development. Norman, I thank you for accepting our invitation and moderating this evening's session with Nadia Hashimi. I'll turn it over to you now, Norman. Thank you.
Great. Well, it's a wonderful pleasure to be here and have an opportunity to talk to a friend that I deeply admire and have the highest praise for her novel. Anyway, I want to thank Nadia for taking the time to talk to us today about her novel, Sparks Like Stars, her most recent novel. She's obviously written numerous novels prior to this. And I'm going to do my best not to begin with overlong praise, but I want to make sure I praise it enough at the outset so that everyone is encouraged to read it. This is a really wonderful novel on so many levels, sweeping in its historical scope. It's got ancient archaeology in the site of Ai-Khanoum. It's got I think it's maybe the only novel I've ever read that both mentions the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, and the band Nirvana, taking you all through history, both in Afghanistan and in the U.S. It is a deeply probing psychological story of how does a nation process trauma and how does an individual process trauma. And there's so many wonderful things I want to say about it, but I'm going to pause there for a moment and just ask Nadia if she could begin by telling us a little bit about how this novel fits into your kind of overall oeuvre, the works you've composed before that obviously focus a lot on Afghanistan and on the United States. How did you come to write this, and what were you thinking of how this fits into what you've done before?
Sure. And let me just say a quick thank you to the organizers of this film festival. It's always nice to kind of reunite with the friends who are part of this team, and nice to be in conversation with you, Norman, of course, always. So this particular novel is one that really was in part inspired by book club discussions that I've had with readers around my other books. And because in those other books, I talk about Afghanistan's history going back, over 100 years, to the time of the monarchs and into, post-Taliban Afghanistan and how families have been forced to flee the country as refugees. So in many of these conversations, we've touched on this, I've heard this question of what happened to Afghanistan? Why has it been in a state of conflict for basically my entire lifetime? And I realized that when I tell people that my mother graduated from Kabul University and she was, a civil engineer and her sisters were going to college and that, that they didn't have to wear a headscarf. Like, there are just so many things that surprise people. And growing up, these were the things that surprised me, were the images that I was seeing on TV, on the nightly news of a war-torn Afghanistan, when the Afghanistan that my parents carried with them into our homes and that was displayed on our walls in family pictures was so starkly different. So I really wanted to answer that question. What happened to Afghanistan? What caused it to topple into 4 decades of conflict, and now it's just starting to hopefully come back out of it? And when I started to, really chew on that question, I remembered that I'd come upon this article in the New York Times. That was a 2009 article that talked about the 1978 coup, one that assassinated the then president of Afghanistan, his wife, the first lady, and several of his family members. And that really talked about, when I started digging more and more, I started to uncover these Cold War tensions and what the landscape looked like. And that's why I chose this particular moment in history. And the conversations that I wanted to have really, again, stemmed from the conversations I was having in book clubs.
Yeah. Oh, that's super fascinating. So let me ask you, it's 2021 right now. What aspects of this book? I know a lot of your writing is a brilliant creative exercise in trying to vivify and draw attention to issues that are going on in Afghanistan and the relationship between the United States and Afghanistan. In 2021, what are there any particular issues going on right now that you think this book, you mentioned the word conversation, do you feel like this book can help us have a conversation right now about some specific topics?
Yeah, I think right now in the Afghan world, we're dealing with a couple of really big issues. One has been the 2019 deal that was struck between the United States and the Taliban, which is basically an exit strategy from the United States to pull back the remaining troops that are there. So that's one thing that's happening right now. And then you've got this, growing Taliban movement that is threatening to destabilize and threatens all the gains that have been made in Afghanistan for the past 20 years. So what we're looking at right now is a moment where the United States is recalibrating its relationship with Afghanistan. And in people talking about, what should the United States do, when I hear the general American public either commenting on posts on Facebook or on news articles, there is this narrative that Afghanistan has never been at peace, and so it'll never be peaceful and we'll never be able to fix it, so let's just get out of there. And that's a false narrative. So that's one thing that I wanted this book to address, not realizing how much I'd be hearing that narrative by the time this book actually came out. But it's also that, I wanted to re-examine the historical relationship between the United States and Afghanistan. And I do think that there's a responsibility to understand there that the United States didn't land in Afghanistan in 2001. It was there prior. There was an ongoing relationship, and they were cultivating a relationship in the 60s, into the 70s, and into the years prior to the coup. And, that's fine, but that was a relationship that was inspired by the Cold War. It was inspired by the Soviet Union also attempting to cultivate a relationship with Afghanistan. So it really was a tug of war that was happening in the late 60s to 70s, with a lot of money coming into the country from these two really big, superpowers, and kind of pulling at the core of Afghanistan's political landscape, which, again, so here we are thinking, well, we went into Afghanistan in 2001 and it's time for us to go out. But we didn't go into Afghanistan in 2001. We went in before that. And we had to work. We were funding freedom fighters. There was a lot that the United States has done over the decades that has led to where we are right now.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I know this is where I'm actually going to praise your work a little bit. Another issue that is of deep concern, I know, to you, is the plight of women in Afghanistan. And to me, one of the marvelous things about this book is the main character, Sitara Ariana. She becomes Ariana, arguably. The main character is also the narrator, and you do this amazing. And one of the themes that you introduce very early on is about the perception of women in Afghanistan by the British in particular, and that the women are somehow they're both ferocious, but they're also kind of monsters, and they're not seen as fully human. And so you illustrate that, I think, really beautifully by having a narrator who is cultured, who is self-aware, who has tasted of amazing foods. She has, been, inside the president's cabinet, as it were, because Her father was an advisor to the president. So, this is someone who, what was the embodiment of Afghanistan, arguably pre-coup, connected to the culture, deeply connected to her father, deeply experienced, deeply self-aware as a narrator. And yet you also show her as a character in the work, and we process her as a character through the eyes of a lot of other people, particularly Americans, when she comes to America. And she's like this figure who almost has no backstory and can't really reveal her backstory. So she's just this object that people project their assumptions about Afghanistan onto, that, when she goes to be raised by a foster family, there's this idea that you just give her like plain food and any amount of it will do, because when she lived in Afghanistan, she must have had nothing and ate bland food or things like that. And then one of the beautiful contrasts you draw is hearing her narrative voice, which is so clear and eloquent, and then you'll hear her learning English, and it's like this broken English, and you start to see that disconnect. And I think for an American reader, it's really valuable to always be reminded of the richness of the characters who may not be coming across as most sophisticated to you, because A, they don't speak the language, and because you have very simplistic assumptions about who they are as people and the culture that they come from. But I don't know if you want to comment on that or say more about that, but I just thought that was a really brilliant technique in storytelling.
I appreciate that. And I think that, one of the goals in my storytelling is to be able to convey these stories kind of outside of that lens of empire, and to kind of decolonize our stories, right? And that's why that quote from, I think it was Rudyard Kipling, and I'm going to butcher it if I try to repeat that quote, but he basically says something like, if you find yourself wounded on Afghanistan's plains and the women come up to, cut up your remains, just roll onto your side and blow out your brains and go to your God like a soldier, like something like that along those lines. And when I read that, it kind of struck me as like, wow, so he's really talking about Afghan women being brutal and almost monstrous, but who are they going out to fight? Well, it's colonizing soldiers coming into their country, right? And so do we want them to be like laying out trays of tea and biscuits? Like, what is it that you would expect them to do, right? So
right, or shoot a gun or something.
I found that verse kind of interesting, because that really is telling the story from, the lens of that particular empire. And what I really wanted to do through this character was, again, to just decolonize history and have her tell her story, and have her tell it from her perspective and her family's perspective.
Yeah, and she strikes that note, very early on, as she wins an essay writing contest in her like school paper or something by saying like, let women tell the story, basically. And I think it's wonderful that this is largely with the one exception perhaps of the character Shair. Am I saying his name right? Shair.
Sure.
And with that kind of one exception, this is mostly a story of trauma and resilience told from the eyes of women and American women as well. And it's really fascinating to see see Sitara try to understand the American women on her terms, and then to see them trying to make sense of her on their terms, and the dialogue that emerges in that. I just thought that was really fantastic. And this leads me to a little bit of a more general question about your evolution as a novelist. Do you feel like were you doing different things in terms of your literary technique, your narrative style, the research that went into this that was different from your previous novels?
So with every novel, I feel like, okay, well, now I've learned so much about the process. With this one, it's going to be so much easier, right? And I'll just be able to crank this out like really fast. But it doesn't work that way. And I think with each novel, each story has its own like training and its own struggle. And to start from like the research aspect, the research is just pure fun for me. I love being able to dig into the history. I love playing the role of a sleuth and trying to figure out how am I going to arrange all these pieces, and which pieces of history do I want to incorporate, and finding the site of Al-Khanum and what happens to museum treasures in a country that's affected by conflict, and being so like taken by that ethical question, and then trying to weave it into the story in some way. So I've learned a few things along the way. It's, one is the research is delicious. It's an indulgence, but I have to make sure that it is what is needed for the story, and it's not just me kind of, wandering around.
Yeah.
And then two is really, really paying attention to the characters and getting to know the characters super well, because when I do, then I'm able to tell the story more effectively, more authentically, and just actually get the writing done more quickly, because they're doing what they need to do, and I don't have to dictate or create their dialogue. I don't have to kind of, guide them in any particular direction or mold them. Like, they're already fully functional and three-dimensional, and then I can just record what they're doing in various scenarios. So I try to balance, what I've learned, but also not overthink it, because, one of the things that I think I've realized in retrospect, a lot of other authors have gone through, some people have gone through like writing programs or taken, whatever they might have done. And I was reading from another author who, Lily King, said that, somebody had asked her, how does she do her creative arc, or some kind of technical question about the writing. And she said, I don't know, I'm like a blind worm on the ground. And when I read that quote of hers, it really struck with me, because I don't feel like I am technically, trying to analyze how I'm going to write the story and define all these elements, these literary elements. I just want to tell you a story. And then somehow in the process of just communicating a story, all of those things are in there. And that is for the other side of it, right? That's for when we want to break down a story and analyze it and pick it apart and decide why we like it, why we don't like it, what works about it, what doesn't work about it. But in writing the story, I try not to be so technical in my thinking and really just let the story kind of breathe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it almost sounds like you begin as a journalist trying to figure out what is the story, like what's there. And then you, at some point, maybe a more creative process takes over, and you say, like, okay, I'm going to alter the history a little bit. I'm going to embellish the history a little bit. I'm going to fabricate a character who is made from authentic historical elements. And then the story kind of writes itself, or guides you, as you say, based on your understanding of the characters and their motivations and things. It's very interesting. I just made this connection. I was talking to Maroa Yejide the other day, another DC novelist whose recent book, Creatures of Passage, is set in 1977. So you have like that similar year. And she was saying she never even begins with a story arc. She just writes, she thinks of the characters and writes vignettes about the characters. And once she's kind of feels like she's said enough about them, then she steps back and says, how do the pieces fit together now? She doesn't even number her chapters for that reason. They're all just kind of vignettes, but they move through history like that. And I like how your novel has the jump from 78 to 2008, and it has a very, but by moving that far ahead, you create all of this anticipation in the reader's mind of like, well, what has happened in the meantime? I want to know so much more. Whereas if you had just progressed chronologically or something, it wouldn't have been as suspenseful, I don't think.
I think so for me, I had a little bit of the timeline dictated by what happened historically. And so there was, the night of the coup, and then there was the discovery of the president's body, his wife's body, and then his family members. And so it was nice to actually have those two particular events, because then it was just, okay, well, what if I use that as my timeline and then build within there?
Yeah.
So it's always interesting to me to hear how other authors and how other writers are approaching this, because there are 1,000,001 ways to do it, right? And none of it's wrong, none of it's right. But I always enjoy hearing other people and hearing how they approach the craft.
Yeah, cool. Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about the themes of the work. We already talked about women and storytelling and the importance of understanding the difference between the storyteller and how a character might be perceived. But trauma is obviously a huge theme in this work. And it's a topic I have to say I've been wrestling with a lot lately because I'm very curious about the relationship between trauma and leadership. You know, trauma is often the kind of thing that, I mean, it does render us incapacitated almost by definition, and yet there are people seem to find very creative ways out of that trauma. And in reading Sparks Like Stars, I was very much reminded of the Iliad because, you know, I'm a classics professor and I always go back to Homer. And, you know, the Iliad, of course, is a story about the fall of Troy. And from the Greek perspective, this was the fall of falls, you know, every awful thing that could happen with the collapse of a city happened with the fall of Troy. And it just captured the imagination of poets for hundreds of years and gave rise to so much of Greek tragedy. But there's also the question, so you deal with the fall of a city, and what does that trauma look like on a, you know, political scale, that, you know, that scope. But then there's this choice of whose eyes do I tell the story of the trauma through? Is it a king? Is it a queen? Is it a peasant? Is it a warrior? Is it all of those somehow? And I thought what's beautiful about this work is that you have these kind of parallel traumas that Sitara experiences herself. Obviously, she loses her family, she loses her country to a great extent, and then of course this is parallel with the collapse of the president's regime there. Can you say, like I want to say that Sitara kind of is Afghanistan on some level, like she's almost like a divinity. She is the mother goddess or the embodiment of Afghanistan, and that her story is Afghanistan's story. Is that going too far to sort of make? I'm using mythic language here, but do you see them as very parallel in that way?
I do. And I think that's, you know, when we look at why we want to press our leaders, for example, why are we talking about climate change, right? It's not because we care about what the Earth's climate is at this particular moment, but we care about what's going to happen 10, 15 years from now, the world that we're giving our children, right? So what really, the impact of any of our decisions or our actions, whether it is on policy or in conflict, it's what is going to be the impact on the next generation. And I think all these people who want to be great leaders, they want to leave a great legacy. Well, for who? It's for the children who are going to grow up into that. So I do see her as sort of the embodiment of the country, because she is a child, and because, you know, that she as a child is sort of a representative of the future of that nation. And what happens to her in that trauma, she is kind of basically unmoored from her country. And so many have been, right? And so she's
right.
She's one of many. She's one of millions who suffered maybe not the exact same loss, but an iteration of that loss, essentially.
Yeah. So kind of along those lines, I want to ask you about remedies for trauma, or how you think, you know, how, without spoiling anything necessarily, but the trauma, I read a good recent definition of it, and that it is, it's described as what they say, a challenge or an invalidation of our assumptive world. In other words, the assumptions we make on a daily basis, like my parents will always be there for me, the government will always be in place, the earth will rest beneath my feet and I can walk on it, you know, there will be gravity. Like we all have to make assumptions about the world to plan or just operate in it moment to moment. And Sitara's character has pretty much every assumption invalidated that one could have invalidated, right? You know, she loses her parents. This character Shayer is, you know, turns out to be an enemy, or she thinks he thinks of him as an enemy. She can't trust anyone, even her own, when she goes back and visits her own home to collect her sister's birth certificate that has been, you know, violated. And, you know, this was my home, and now it's, you know, it's been ransacked and things like this. And then there's, so when your assumptive world has been invalidated like this, there then becomes this question of like, okay, what are the pieces to make it feel valid again. What is the ground? You used the word unmoored a moment ago. What is the ground? What is the mooring, or what is the ground that we can find in that world? And I want to ask you first, how do you feel that Sitara does this? Again, without revealing too many details. And do you think her, let's say, the restoration of her assumptive world, does that in any way parallel what needs to happen for Afghanistan? Again, going with this idea, is she like an embodiment of Afghanistan, and is she analogous to Afghanistan in some way? If that, I know that was a long build up to a question, but if that makes sense.
No, but I love that that way of understanding what trauma really is. It's just being like having everything that you believe shaken, right? And I think that's what she experiences in the very, very early in her lifetime, when she has, her family taken away from her, when she loses her country. And, and in exploring trauma through her, I think she meets along the way the American women who were stationed in Kabul. Well, one is Antonia, and her mother, who happens to be visiting Tilly, who is in a very, eccentric character. But in them too, and getting to know them, she also gets to take, she gets a glimpse of the trauma that is in Antonia's life as well, and probably in some way in Tilly's life too.
Sure. Yeah.
Where she's involved in that trauma. And, to understand that trauma is not a uniquely Afghan experience. And I think that's something that everybody needs to understand. I think one thing it helps is to understand that you're not alone in trauma. And I think that's why, we tell people to go to like group therapy or to support groups, in order to just understand that there are others, because it is really, really, I think, a very solitary feeling in the moment, especially when people are not talking about it, or you don't have a community to grieve with, to mourn with, or to struggle with. And then I think that the goal is always to recreate some of that stability, right? To like resurrect the ground under that person's feet again. And there will be trust issues. There will be ongoing feelings of insecurity. And so you start to figure out, for each particular, and everything is so individual, but to figure out, how do you recreate that feeling that they are, that they are tethered, that they are supported, that they have some kind of safety net underneath them, that they won't be as vulnerable to, an ongoing, or that it's not going to happen at every particular moment. And then, of course, there is a possibility of another traumatic event in every individual's life. So I think we're also trying to be, honest that things might come up. And so that's where I think, I hear a lot of conversations now with our kids too, talking about resilience and how do we instill resilience in people without undermining the impact of a traumatic event, right? Without saying, well, just, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get back out there and be fine. But understanding that there can be a path to recovery, to healing, to, sort of redefining oneself and what their terms might be and how they understand the world around them, to not feel so rocked.
Yeah. No, I think there's something profoundly paradoxical about trauma, in that, as you say, it's initially very isolating, and you don't really get more isolated than Sitara, having to be rescued, as it were, by the person she suspects of participating in the cause of her trauma, right? And it's very isolating, but at the same time, she gets to know Nia and Tilly, and particularly Nia's trauma of losing a father that she clearly felt very close to, being alienated from her mother. So there's this weird paradox, as I say, where you're both isolated, but yet your trauma can sometimes put you in a position where you're more deeply connected to another person than you ever would have been. Like your trauma actually connects you to other people. And as you say, it's good to know that this is not kind of it's not an experience that is particular to one nation or one group of people at any one time.
And I think we've seen that in the past, year and a half now, right? Where we've seen, it's so heartbreaking to see the news coming out of countries that are still hit with really bad waves of this pandemic, where the death rates are so high. In the South Asian continent, we've seen, Canada, areas of Canada are still in a lockdown. And I think that one of the things that happened in this particular pandemic in this year is that people were able to see how valuable it was to connect with one another. And people were doing it on Facebook groups. They were commiserating on, what it's like to be home with the kids, what it's like to have a sick family member in the hospital who is in an ICU, and yet you can't go and visit them, you can't go and be with them, to understand that there are shortages and what are we going to do about this scarcity feeling, and how to grapple with that too. So I think there's a lot of learning that can be done from our experience, our collective experience this past year too.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I want to, another piece, and I still want to get to this question about the trauma of Afghanistan as a nation, and how does a nation move out of that trauma. But there's a place on page 16 where you talk about gratitude, which I thought was really profound. You said, Sitara says, "My mother was ever grateful. People who have suffered generally were." And then on the following page, you say, "With a kind of magic." So she goes on to talk about how Sitara's parents lost a daughter when she was very young, and that was traumatic for the parents. But that I love this line, and I want to praise your eloquence here. You say, "With a kind of magic I didn't fully appreciate as a child, my parents spun grief into gratitude. I knew my mother was thinking of my long-gone sister as she watched Fahim nestle close to me. She never tired of telling us the greatest comforts God could have given her. Being a child, I took this to mean we had suffered our allotted tragedy." And seldom were more ironic words ever spoken than that. But could you say a little bit more about this idea of gratitude as a I don't know if antidote is the right word, but as a response or part of resilience to trauma?
Yeah, I think that, you try to find a reaction that is going to help make sense of what people went through. And I think that that gratitude feeling is one way to process grief, to process a traumatic event. I think when we talk to people who have lost someone that they love, so often you hear people say, "You had all these good years together, right?
Right.
And that love will stay with you." And so there's a lot of that in the book, because I was really thinking about, how does this individual process this traumatic event? How did her family process it? How does anyone process? And along the way, when she becomes a physician, she's dealing with families, with individuals who are facing cancer, who are facing, really tragic diagnoses. And is that less tragic than, surviving a coup? There's no measuring
Right.
of trauma, right? There's no scale for these things. So, but we all have to figure out, what do we do with it? How do we reconfigure it so that we can actually, not be devastated by it, but continue to move on? And that's what her mother does, is that she takes that grief, and when she has her next children, she's deeply, deeply grateful. Not that she wouldn't be grateful for her children either way, but there's just a different, shade to her gratitude for her love for her children. There's something in there that's informed by what she's been through before. And I think that almost seems like the most of what we can hope for, with some of these really hard experiences, is that, individuals are able to take from it, grow from it, learn from it, or just experience life in a way that is enhanced because of it.
Right. Yeah. So what about, one last thing, and then I do want to get to the Afghanistan question. There's a lot of tension when you brought up the topic of Ariana Sitara being an oncologist. There's a lot of delicacy. She talks about learning the language of talking about this traumatic experience with her patients, with the families of her patients. There's a real skill to talking about that trauma. Would you say, kind of as a general, I think it's a tension in the novel, but would you say as a general rule, talking about trauma is better than not talking about trauma? And what's your theory as to why yes or no?
I think yes. And I think, you want to be mindful that you're doing it in an appropriate setting. You're not rushed, you're not kind of exposing someone at a moment where they may feel very vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot that comes into the setup for a conversation and kind of, dipping in slowly, carefully. But I think it's always better to talk about these things. Otherwise, the person who has experienced it might feel like, okay, me kind of shoving it into a dark box and just hanging on to it and letting it, just gnaw away at me is the right thing to do because nobody else wants to talk about it either. Maybe it is a shameful thing for me to be carrying around. Maybe there's a lot of like subconscious thinking that goes with it, especially if it was a child who had experienced something. So I think there's a lot of destigmatizing that has to happen and just, easing into these conversations carefully. My husband, as you know, is a surgeon. And so when he goes in to see patients, one of the first questions he asks them is not so much about their symptoms or, what kind of pain they're feeling or anything like that. But one of the first questions he asks everybody that he sees is, who do you live with? And he has found that, over the years of seeing patients in the hospital or having them come through an emergency room, that has been a really revealing question because it helps reveal the context, not just, what the acute issue that's happening in their lives, but the context. And I think that's, what I try to do in the storytelling as well is it's not just the character entering an event and then, struggling through it. It is a character with a certain context, right? With a certain family, with a certain backdrop, prior experiences, all of that coming into play that will help dictate what do they do with this particular event? Do they survive it? Do they not survive it? Do they struggle with it? Are they here because they didn't have anybody else with them? So there's I think really, a lot of value into digging a little bit deeper and understanding the broader context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think so. Yeah, talking about it, but talking about it with context. This is something that Sitara tries to build with her boyfriend, Adam, when they go to that book reading from the war correspondent, right? She's trying to lay the foundation to say, this is what it was like. And by the way, this is what it was like for me. So again, praise for your book that it creates a context really for more people to be able to talk about that trauma. So I want to ask you now, I mean, just again, because you're very invested in these issues, like the trauma of Afghanistan, if we can call it that, from 1978 forward. We've talked about connection, we've talked about gratitude, we've talked about talking about it and context. Like, is that the special sauce for moving forward? Again, is Sitara a stand-in for Afghanistan in this way, or am I pushing that analogy too far?
No, I think she could be. She really easily could be, and I think that her asks would probably be the same asks of the people of Afghanistan, and more particularly the women of Afghanistan. Is please don't forget where our relationship started, right? Please don't forget my history. Please don't forget me in general. And please convince me or reaffirm for me that you believe in me and that you wish me well. So I think that's really what, this character is asking for. And she's put in the work herself, right? She's not saying, oh, woe is me and come and save me by any means.
Right. Yeah.
Fought for herself. She has rebuilt this life for herself. I mean, she has resurrected herself despite it all. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not in the way that is, the straightest path to healing, but in her own ways, she has done it. And so the same for Afghanistan. The women, the people there, they're working their struggle. They're doing their parts. It's going to take some figuring out, but I think what they're looking for is that don't forget me. Believe in me, because that having someone believe in you is huge, right? And I think that when you look at Afghanistan as well, it's over 50% of the population is afflicted by some kind of mental health condition, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress. So it is very real. What she's experiencing is what the people of Afghanistan are experiencing.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. And I wonder, too, getting back to that word context, you know, we're 2 generations out from this coup now. Like how many modern people in Afghanistan who are in their 20s or maybe even in their 40s know about this previous time, you know, this what may feel like a mythic past when things didn't have to be this way. Like, I don't know enough about the education system there or media or things like that. Or can people call on this past in their minds and work from it?
I think they can. I think, you know, what's the education system has been just, you know, it has been blossoming. So it's going in the right direction. It just takes some time to get there. And I don't know specifically how much time they spend on history, how much time they're spending on, you know, the different subjects. And I think that, you know, it's hard to know how far back people are able to go. Do they go back? It's like always, where do you start, right? Where do you start the story? Where do you start history? You can keep going and keep going and keep going. So, and I think there is some value to the students, to the people there learning the history, because I think there's a lot of pride that comes from that. So I do think that and you speak with any Afghan, they'll tell you that, you know, the British tried to invade, the Soviets tried to invade, and then, you know, that there's been a history of Afghanistan kind of beating out invaders, but also on the flip side of beating out invaders is suffering a lot of losses and a lot of trauma. So, and then with the Taliban as well, ousting the Taliban, that was another sort of invasive force.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the example of Ai-Khanoum is important, at least for Sitara. You know, she's often thinking back to this as kind of a utopian period, or at least, you know, a time when it didn't have to be the way it is right now, and it was so long ago that it feels even more permanent and possible. I know we need to move on to questions from the audience, but I want to ask one last question, just because I love words and I love language. And you mentioned in the author's note where the title of Sparks Like Stars comes from, and you say this woman, Nadia Anjuman, am I saying it right?
Yes.
Anjuman, and her poem, you describe it as a stirring work, the night's poetry. So what does Sparks Like Stars mean in that context? I have an idea about what it means in the novel, but coming from that context, what does it mean?
Yeah, so let me give you a little bit of context to why the title is important. Yeah. And that's because I am horrible at coming up with titles. So I have 6 books. You would
never know.
No. That's because I don't come up with these titles. I have 6 books that are out now. I've come up with one title, and that's for one of the children's books. So I write these books. At this point, I've learned that when I have my manuscript on my computer, I just save it as like the story that I'm working on. That's it. That's the title of it. Because it's always time for me to like think about the title. The title doesn't really come until the end. So once I'm completely done with it. And for this one, you know, for my other books, the titles have come from lines of Sufi poetry, if it's, you know, Hafiz or Rumi. And in my mind for this one, I really was like, I would love to use an Afghan woman's poetry as that little thing that's in there that'll be in the story, and I can, you know, extract the title from it in some kind of way, the way I've done with the other ones. But my agent has been the person who has found these titles, who has found the right poem and then extracted the right line for the title of the books. And so, you know, what happens one day, I get a call from my agent, and I had not told her what I wanted to do. I get a call from my agent. She's in New York. She's with my editor, and she says, "We have an idea for a title for you. What do you think about Sparks Like Stars?" And I was like, "Oh, there's something about it that I really like." And then she said, "Well, it comes from this poem from Nadia Anjuman, who's an Afghan woman poet." And I just kind of like, and I had her poems in a book on my shelf. I just hadn't found this one. And so it really like fell into place. It was the right thing. It was the right line. Nadia Anjuman was a very prolific poet whose life was cut off short. She was murdered by her husband. But in her short life, she put out many, many poems that really spoke about the anguish, the pain, the hardships of being a woman in Afghanistan. And this is in fairly contemporary Afghanistan. So in a Taliban to post-Taliban Afghanistan. And so in that line of poetry, she says something, and I don't want to paraphrase it too poorly, but she says, sparks spill from my sighs, or sighs spill from my, I'm going to horribly butcher it right now, which is awful, right?
No, I shouldn't have put you on the spot.
She's basically saying that, there's so much pain, there's so much angst, that there's just like sparks pouring out into her sighs. In her exhalations, there are these like sparks, right? And so it was just this image of just breathing, just existing, just breathing, being painful, being this fiery event. So that's why I think it spoke to me, but it's also in the story, there's a bit of astrology, not a lot, but there's a little bit of astrology in there, because I think that I love ideas of, looking to the stars for inspiration, for hope, for the stories that they tell us as well, and the connections that they take us to the past, because people have been looking at stars forever, right? The same stars.
Right. Yeah, no, well, that's fascinating. I always think we tend to think of stars as being permanent, but of course they're not. They have a life cycle like anything else, but it's just far beyond what humans can comprehend. But the idea of that a sigh of pain or anguish could be, like the sun that's just this boiling hot mass is quite powerful and quite interesting. So thank you for that context. That really enriches the story a lot for me. So I want to transition now and invite, we have a couple questions in the chat right now, and I want to invite more. And so let's start with Vandana has the question, did you put any of your own family's stories into the story? You mentioned your mother being, you said mechanical engineer?
Civil engineering, yeah.
Civil engineering, thank you. Yeah.
So my mother had graduated from Kabul University as a civil engineer, and I didn't put her into the story. I only, I put into the story her Afghanistan, my father's Afghanistan, the country that they lived in. So some of the experiences of them just kind of being in a Kabul, the music, the clothing, that kind of stuff. One of my uncles told me about, just the climate. I've heard from many, many family members, actually, the climate of that time, the suspicions within the population, because political alliances were so, important. It was very questioned. Who are you aligned with, and what does that mean? And there were people being disappeared and jailed, and that kind of, unrest that would naturally lead up to a coup. So it was those kinds of just the general climate of Afghanistan that went into the story. I leaned into my own experience only in that she is a physician. She is in New York in her medical training on 9/11. And that for me was such a pivotal experience as an Afghan American that I wanted to give her that moment of history to experience, to see what she would do with it and how she experienced it as well. Because I think for any Afghan American, that was the pivotal moment where we went from anonymous to, oh my gosh, everyone's looking at us, and there are a lot of questions.
Yeah, I had the sense that it might have been autobiographical, the little piece about the three men accosting her and saying, we're going to kill all of you, or something like that.
I had a little bit of a similar moment right after 9/11. I was walking with three of my friends who happened to be, olive-skinned, 2 Egyptian, 1 South Asian, and so the Afghan community was not alone in experiencing that blowback, because you don't walk around with a sign that says Afghan or whatever it is, right? And it's been tragic to see what blowback the Sikh community, some of the South Asian community members have faced, because people just don't know who to blame, and then they just start blaming generically,
Radhika says, what were some of the obstacles that you faced while writing this particular story?
Well, there's always writer's block, right?
Yeah, how long did it take you to write this? I'm curious.
So I started this one, I walked away from it for a bit, I came back to it, and in writing a story, it took probably like 1.5 years-ish for this one, which is a bit on the longer side for me. But then there's like the back and forth with the editor, that kind of process. But this one, I had to figure out how to tell the story, and I'll describe it as like, you're going to film a movie, but where do you put the cameras? where do you start the story? Where do you end the story? Where do you put the cameras? And I do a dual storyline where I'm also telling it from Antonia's perspective, the American Foreign Service officer who's working at the American Embassy at the time, where it was like a party post. And I really wanted to talk about the American experience too, because here they are in Kabul having drinks with the Russians. Like literally the night before, they're having drinks with the Russians. There's an international, like they're just parties. It's a party post. You've got hippies wandering through, right? And you've got just all kinds of individuals who are there for this exotic experience, not thinking that there is a lot of unrest just below the surface, and it's all about to, come to a head in this coup. So I was kind of deciding like how to do this, and it really wasn't working in the earlier draft. And it was my agent actually who was just so astute, and she said, just focus on the girl. And so that was one thing that took me a bit to figure out. Just focus on the girl, just tell it from her perspective, and that really helped clarify the story and clean it up.
Yeah, so I think you answered the question I'm about to ask, but I was curious, like when you do that using the filming analogy, do you write much more than goes into the book, and is there an editing process, or do you find yourself starting to write and then realizing like, no, I don't need to shoot this scene, or I don't need to go in this great depth because it's really not going to fit the story?
Yeah, so I had shot from Antonia's perspective, so I'd written chapters,
Yeah.
and there are chapters that I've written, and then I'm like, okay, well, this isn't working, and I have to take it out. And then to make myself feel better so I can sleep that night, I put it in a side folder, and I say, it's okay, I'm going to put it here for now, and I will use it later. I will find a way to reinsert all this hard work later. It'll
be a spin-off. It'll be a spin-off. There'll be like a whole season of what it was like for Antonia.
And it ends up never being needed. It ends up never going back in, because what's really necessary from that, which is cut, is the process, is the figuring out of things. And then all of the essentials get incorporated into the story from Sitara's perspective, right? So everything that's really vital, I can include back in there. But I do have to comfort myself a little bit and say, it's
right.
Save it, put it here, and it'll go right back in later and up that word count again.
Yeah, well, it's almost like the director's cut. Like when you do a book reading or something, you could just have that. Okay, so Geeta says, how has been the feedback on your books and social work in Afghanistan?
So it's been really exciting because, for a long time I had these books out and I didn't really have a connection to the reading world in Afghanistan until a few years back. I heard from someone who has a bookshop in Kabul, and he emailed me and said, I just want to let you know your books are selling very well here, and we're looking forward to getting the next one. I was like, oh, that's amazing, and they're selling in English. So this past year, I actually was contacted by a group called Kabul Reads. They run a sort of an online bookstore, and then they have a writing group as well. And we arranged a virtual visit. So I did like a book club with the group in Kabul. And they're really excited because there's this new generation. Afghanistan's really, really young. The demographic is like about 75% under the age of 30 or something like that.
Wow.
They are, and the young people who are getting their education, they're really, they're like thirsty for this stuff. So they told me that they're selling a lot of like Jane Austen, and they said the young people are actually not reading this for academics. They're reading it because this is what they want to read. So they're reading very widely, very diversely, from business to the classics. And they're really interested not just in reading and consuming, but they're trying to figure out how to tell their stories as well. So I'm starting to hear a lot more writing and creativity coming out of Afghanistan, including into the visual media as well. So now they have the Kabul movie house, and the head of the Kabul film house is actually a woman. So there's a lot of emphasis now on their own stories, and I've been in touch with some of these individuals, and it's been a really positive experience.
If you could get sparks like stars on the desk of any person, and they kind of assign them to read it, who would you pick?
That I couldn't tell you. I don't think I know these folks well enough, but I will. Someone had asked me, who would you pick to play certain roles, and I don't really know. I know that I would want an Afghan to play Sitara because I want someone authentic, and I think that that's the right thing to hope for at this moment. But I will say that for the part of Tilly, who is such an eccentric, American woman who is like, getting high on a rooftop in Kabul when there's a coup going on.
Yeah.
I would pick
Frances
Betty.
McDormand. Who was that?
Oh, okay. Betty White.
Oh, okay. You don't think she's a little old? I was picturing Frances McDormand the whole time.
I mean, I don't know. I grew up on the Golden Girls, so I'm kind of
fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. Of the Golden Girls, she's probably the best. Okay, last question. I think that's for me to shut up. What kind of research did you do to write a historically correct story?
Okay, so the research for this book went in several different directions. And one is to talk about, what was it like for an American Foreign Service officer in Kabul. And there is an online archive of American diplomatic studies and training where they have interviewed, I don't know how many Foreign Service officers who've served around the world over history. And so I went through and dug through the interviews with Americans who had served in Afghanistan, in Kabul during those years. And then I found one of these individuals. I did a bunch of online sleuthing, and I found this woman, Louise Taylor. I interviewed her. I talked to her. We exchanged emails. And so I was able to get a lot of juicy details, like the fact that they were having a performance of the musical Oklahoma.
Nice.
At the embassy putting on musicals because it's such a party town for them, right? The archaeology, I used resources like, there's different archaeological texts that are available. And then, the National Geographic has one. This is one that was written by a family friend about the history of art and the buried treasures in Afghanistan. This is a book that I used for the diplomatic studies and the experience of a woman Foreign Service officer and what it was like to break through the glass ceiling there. There's one woman who said, on her application, she wrote that she couldn't type very well because if she had said she could type very well, she would have been a secretary, and she didn't want to be a secretary.
Oh,
no. So those are the pieces, and then I use a lot of imagery. So I happen to have this stuff sitting with me, but I use pictures of the presidential palace because and then aerial shots of the grounds as well. This is a picture of the American embassy at that time period, because I want to be authentic and I want to make sure that I know where I am, that I have something, as a touchstone to return to. And then the best part was reading the travel guides and looking at photographs of hippies who talk about where to get the best weed, where to get the best massages in Turkey. How to avoid customs checkpoints and where to rent a camel from, all those delicious. When I'd find them, I'd be like, stuff it in the story because it is just too good.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, I think we're out of time. I just want to make my last final plug for Sparks Like Stars. If you're not convinced by now, let me just say one more time what an amazing work this is, and I love it because it's a framework for a conversation. So I recommend people to get it, give a copy to a friend, and build a conversation with them about all the important issues that this amazing novel raises. Nadia, do you want to say any final words? Or I don't know how to end one of these.
No, I really just appreciate everyone for tuning in, for keeping the humanities alive. That's been so important in keeping us connected, and you do so much, obviously, Norman, to keep the humanities alive and elevated through your teaching and through Kalyan. So I'm thankful to the South Asian Literary Festival as well, and to book clubs. I love joining book clubs. You guys have inspired this particular story in a large way. So I hope that everyone can continue to regroup and come together around stories, because that's the best way to do it.
But thank you, Nadia. This has been so much fun.
Likewise. Thank you so much.